Good evening, everyone, and thanks again for coming. As Kerry has mentioned, I am an avid comic fan, and I was delighted to be invited to host this evening because of my fondness of comics, but also because when I did a science communication master's degree a little while ago, I had the opportunity to choose my own dissertation topic. And I decided I would look at the depictions of science, technology, and engineering in comic books and graphic novels. And when I tell people this, I got a range of different responses. The vast majority of people went, ha ha ha, thinking that was a bit of a joke. It was a get out from my master's degree. Some people sort of went, why are you doing that? Thinking that comics aren't worth study. They're not engaged enough, they're not a significant enough media for somebody doing a master's degree to be looking at. And then there were a handful of people who just went, cool. And those were the people that I think understood that comics are not just pulp material for young boys. Comics have an intrinsic value as part of our culture. The series of quotes you can see are actually quotes that I researched as part of my dissertation, which I hope will go part of the way towards informing you that comics are in fact a significant part of our culture and one that we should consider just as valid as any other form of literature, movies, music, poetry, etc. I was very aware that there are a number of comic book characters with a scientific history one way or the other. In fact, the vast majority of them have science somewhere at the core of their story. It may be that they are artificially endowed with their powers due to a scientific accident, or they're intentionally endowed with their powers due to their own formula that they have developed. Even when you have somebody who has their own powers because they're an alien, the main point being Superman, powered by Earth's yellow sun, you'll find that the people who wish to take him down tend to rely on science, technology, and engineering in order to do so. So the science is always there in comics, and it provides a framework that people can understand, can comprehend, and can start to deal with scientific topics in perhaps a way that other media can't. So moving on to introduce our speaker for this evening. Paul Gravett, also known as the Man at the Crossroads, is a London-based writer, lecturer, broadcaster, and curator of comics, and a comics activist specialising in international comics art. He co-founded Escape magazine in 1983 in order to promote a new generation of British talent. And in fact, there are still projects going on to try and get more British artists into the comic book arena. He has curated numerous exhibitions in the UK and abroad. Most recently, there was the Comics Uncovered exhibition at the exhibition at the British Library this summer. I hope some of you who were interested were able to go along. And he's also the author of Manga, 60 Years of Japanese Comics. I'm now very nervous I'm going to get these book titles wrong, so I will read these. Graphic novels, Stories to Change Your Life, and Comics Art. He's also co-author of Great British Comics, Incredibly Strange Comics, and Comics Unmasked, and editor of the Mammoth Book of Best Crime Comics, which is what I obviously needed to say more carefully. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, The Times Literary Supplement, Art Review, Comic Heroes, and you can find it on his website at paulgravett.com. The details for that will be up later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Gravett. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'm really impressed with the turnout tonight. Thank you so much for this. I mean, I've done a quick vox pop. How many of you read comics now? Quite a few, but quite a few don't. And how many of you have read comics at least at some point in your life? That's most of you, actually. That's good to see. But still, some of you didn't put your hands up. So, yeah. As Ben was just saying, I mean, said very eloquently and succinctly, what I'm going to expand upon now, this next this presentation, is that comics really are an extraordinary medium. And they've done extraordinary things. They're full of imagination and fantasy and absurd ideas, but quite often, as Ben's mentioned, there is a scientific principle behind them. There's often a fascination that can be engendered in their young readers, male and female, that can often lead to a passion for science and perhaps also chemistry. And this is the first time I think the Royal Society of Arts has ever actually sort of properly addressed comics in its august, beautiful building. I've done various interesting talks just recently. I did one, in fact, a few weeks ago at the Petrie Museum of Egyptology, which I thought, well, yes, there's Egyptology in comics, of course there is. And they were actually screening a marvellous movie by a French artist called Bilal, called Immortal, which has alien Egyptian gods arriving in a future Paris in a giant pyramid-shaped spaceship. It just starts from there, really. But it's a tremendously interesting crossover, again, between comics and another field. Because, of course, the point is that we so often think of comics as being one narrow genre. I mean, even if it's perhaps the superhero genre, we have a narrow idea that it's just that and nothing more. When in actual fact, you could have a comic, or this fancy term, graphic novel, in every category of this library, and in fact in every library in the world, because comics, one way or another, have tackled almost every subject you can imagine. There isn't yet the Mammoth Book of Breast Crime comics, but I'm working on it. But that probably does exist. There certainly are breast crime comics out there, I'm afraid. But we're going to have a look at the moment, transitioning essentially, the main arc of this talk will be going from the fantasy to the factual, but they'll be kind of crossing over between the two. And I'll show you some characters that you'll be very familiar with. Many of you will say, why didn't he mention... Well, Spider-Man's not in this, but I mean, there's so many. I could have been here we could have had a whole week just talking about the superheroes and their chemical and scientific interactions. That's interesting to mention, Brett, because, of course, one of their beginnings was actually in American pulp magazines. Before you had the familiar comic book, the 32-page stapled 10-cent, now about $5 or something, little pamphlets. One of the big areas for comics in America, or comic ideas, fanciful ideas and science fiction ideas, were the pulps. Things like amazing stories and weird tales, for example, where many early pulp writers, literally working for like a cent per page, practically a tiny, tiny amount of pay, would come up with the ideas that would lead into and generate many of the heroes that we know today. It's no accident that, for example, Doc Savage was known as the Man of Steel. We now think of the Man of Steel, of course, as Superman. But I'm going to show you a few characters now. Let me just see if I can get this to wait forward and see where we go first. Oh, yeah. But the context I wanted to start with was this, which I thought was rather nice, that this isn't the first time that comics have been really celebrated here, because Jess Hamm, who hopefully by now has graduated from Oxford, she was an undergraduate at the time, got this Bill Bryson Prize for her very wacky, funky, interesting comic, which was a mixture basically of factual chemical stuff, chemistry stuff, with superheroes yet again, but a very bizarre set of superheroes called Flask in a Mask. I don't think coming to a cinema multiplex soon near you, but who knows, strange things have happened. This was the winning entry she came up with, which deals with the Olympics and chemical substances being used essentially to enhance various athletes' performance, including a sort of hulked out Boris Johnson there in the last panel, which is rather alarming, really. And wonderful to see that was acknowledged as worthy of winning the prize in 2012. So, well, I hope Jess is somewhere out there and maybe still making comics, because she's actually got a real talent for them. But I thought I'd go back to some of the transformed characters, how they became superheroes, and look at the chemical aspect in particular that comes into it. So this is perhaps a character you won't know so well as, say, Superman, who of course we could have brought in at this point, and Ben's mentioned with his powers are basically acquired from the sun. But this is Plastic Man, who, as a crook, was known as Eel, as in slippery, Eel O'Brien, who in an accident gets, in fact, as he's escaping the police, gets covered in acid. Acid does come up a few times in these characters, and wakes up to find that he can actually, when he stretches and wakes, he can stretch out to about sort of 18 feet across the room, and discovers also that his face can also be contorted. And surprisingly, and this isn't terribly emotionally clarified in this origin story, he decides to go from, well, now that he can stretch, he's going to actually become an opponent of crime. He's going to actually become a superhero and dress up in a bright red and black outfit as Plastic Man. We haven't quite got the motivation clear there, I don't think, but even so, Plastic Man is a wonderfully playful character. What's particularly brilliant about this is that, of course, you can always, or nearly always, spot where Plastic Man is on the page, because even if he's transformed into a chair, that could be Plastic Man, in fact, himself. But it's always that signature red with the little yellow bit and the black bit, and you know where he is around from story to story. Now, he was the first of there are a sort of subgenre of stretchable superheroes. This tangle on the cover just here is actually Plastic Man meeting Elongated Man. He doesn't actually get his powers, his stretchability from chemicals, but he does actually drink a special Yucatan fruit drink called Gingold. I've tried looking it up on Google. I don't think it exists. I think it must be made up. It looks a bit like ginkgo, but it's gingo, and Gingold is the drink. And he was more of a 60s character. He was a modern, stretchable character, as of course was Mr. Fantastic. He's on the right there. He's in the Fantastic Four. Reed Richards, the super scientist. He got his powers from cosmic rays, as all of his fellow Fantastic Four characters did. They're transformed by some sort of mysterious radiation in space. But yeah, stretchable powers is very much the whole transforming of the physique. Obviously, is a very exciting way of showing the effects of transformation of chemicals on superhero characters. It can also, of course, affect people in more negative ways. This could easily be, in many ways, Eel O'Brien, the Plastic Man character. Here he is, a villain, in fact, wearing a red hood. He's called the Red Hood, escaping from Batman, and he goes into this toxic bath of various nasty elements. And as you may be familiar from the movies, emerges, of course, as the Joker. His face is bleached white, his lips stretched into this terrifying grin, his hair turned green, and he doesn't decide to become a superhero. Quite the opposite. He becomes a totally terrifying, maniacal villain, and one of the most iconic characters, of course, in comic books. This is drawn, of course, by Brian Bond. Anyway, but the Joker, I think, represents... this origin, by the way, wasn't actually explained at the very beginning. When they first came up with him, they didn't think like that. These comics Batman began, for example, in 1939. Characters would appear just from out of the air, and they often were not explained. And their rationales and motivations were only later worked out. And what's become increasingly complicated is the way these characters can become more, their stories can be rewritten, their origins can be retold and adjusted and tweaked, new little permutations can be added to it. And there are now, I can assure you, multiple versions of most of these characters, to the point where you really do need a scorecard to keep up with them all. There are all these different multiple universes, multiple versions of them. As you may also be very familiar, characters die, especially in superhero comics, but death is only temporary. As we all know, I'm sure we're surrounded by lots of scientists here who know that, and they come back with alarming regularity. In fact, there's a superb book out called Super Graphic, which I recommend you check out. It's just information graphics, like the book you had here, this gentleman had, but all about superheroes, and it's absolutely hilarious. There's a particular chart which shows a timeline from around 1980, when this phenomenon really took off, through to the present day, showing the number of times, the different characters who've died, and how long they stayed dead, which often isn't very long, and often means they've died actually even several times over the last 30 or so years and come back again. So we're in a very strange phase of comics now where characters don't die. There's a reason for that. Fundamentally, of course, it's merchandising. These characters are such powerful brands that you can raise enormous attention when you kill a character off, but then at the same time you can't do without them because you've got to sell the next film or the next T-shirt or the next video game, for example. Okay, now the human bomb. An unfortunate character, really, unfortunate power. This is not the original version, I should explain. This is a redrawn version by C.C. Beck from '77. The original was created by Paul Gustafsson in 1941. And, well, he's a character example, as has been mentioned, of a scientist, in fact, in this case, the son, in fact, I should say, son and assistant of a scientist, who discovers an explosive formula, which, of course, is being chased after, is being by corrupt powers. This is all taking place, of course, during the Second World War. It's very much an American propaganda character. The villains are the Nazis. And in this instance, he actually grabs the capsule and swallows it, which is perhaps not the best place to hide it, but I suppose it's all right. And as a result, his body grows, as you can see here, it throws off a strange glow, and he starts to realize that he can actually set off explosions from his own physique, as it were. As it says here, the bruised intruders gape in astonishment at Roy Lincoln's physical mysticism. And as a result of this, he realizes that he's going to become rather volatile and could cause a lot of problems walking around, just generally having a normal life. So he has to come up with a costume of his own. But in fact, there you can see, of course, the explosive scene where he does defeat the villain and realizes his power. My fist did that. When I'm punched, I must be full of explosive, a bomb. So, but he's safeguarded this super secret formula and becomes the human bomb as a fighting crime, of course, in this completely enclosed outfit, which he takes the gloves off for so that he can actually cause explosions as necessary and control them. And as many superheroes did during the Second World War, they acquired comedy sidekicks, many of which, not like Robin, who is, of course, with Batman, is a sort of teenage identified character, but this is the character Eustace Throckmorton, who, as far as I can gather, has similar powers, but only from his feet. Which creates another interesting story twist. But as you can imagine, we haven't seen very many human bomb films starring George Clooney or whatever, and I don't think we will. He's though still in what they call continuity, which is the world of these interconnected characters, which is probably actually the most remarkable collaborative tapestry of legend making that I think has probably ever existed. I mean, I know we've got incredible legends in all cultures, but to have this many people since at least 1938, when Superman first appeared, still working on new variations and of these characters, still adding to it daily, is extraordinary. Now, Hourman, TikTok Tyler, he got his strength from Miraclo vitamins, but as his name suggests, he could only do 60 minutes of crime fighting, then had to have a rest. Basically, basically the vitamins ran out. So this does put a certain pressure. Fortunately, his powers enabled him to move quite well, to give him sort of super speed and to be able to act with tremendous alacrity. But the fact is that that was a somewhat limited power. Speaking of super speed, perhaps the most important and famous speedster character is the Flash, currently on TV, in fact, in a new incarnation. And this is the origin sequence famously from his first appearance, where as so often happens, by the way, in these stories, of course, you can't really have a set chemical that's explained anywhere, or that there's anything that could be repeated, because this is obviously an unrepeatable chaos of chemicals being washed over somebody conveniently when lightning strikes. That's quite a difficult thing to kind of do scientifically. It'd be quite interesting. I mean, you would say, can we make a flash? Can we work out what the chemicals were? And this is the sequence, beautifully told, in 1956, where he first realizes that, this is Barry Allen, who is the original Flash, realizes that he can actually see things in slow motion, that he is living at a heightened speed, more quick than the rest of us. And from there, as so often, of course, he takes inspiration actually from the Golden Age Flash. This is not the first Flash. There was a Flash back in the 1940s, who, as you can see, was dressed more like Mercury, had a winged helmet and things. But and as it turns out, Barry Allen is a fan of comic books. He's also, by the way, rather tardy and not very good at being punctual and a bit slow. So, of course, is a characteristic which, of course, is parodied in the comic when he ends up becoming the Flash, and his life obviously changes. He has a vacuum-compacted costume, much more modern-looking, of course, in his ring, and becomes the Flash. I think what's clever about this comic, and what's interesting about it in terms of what was going on at this period, this is 56, is that we've got essentially the beginnings of the space race, of course. Superheroes have really been out of fashion from around since the end of the Second World War in America, basically taken over by, should we say, slightly more adult themes, crime comics, horror comics, romance comics. They were a very successful medium, but they were also, of course, competing with TV. And TV, once that got in, well, romance comics slightly sort of trailed away, and crime did as well, because all those stories, of course, were being handled in daily soap operas or weekly TV shows, Dragnet, and all those other popular programs. So the superhero was tested out in 56 to see would there be an audience for it. And in fact, this was the beginning. This very comic is seen as the sort of year one, if you like, of the modern revival since the 60s of the superhero characters from DC and then subsequently from Marvel. And in the early 60s, DC Comics also came up with brand new team of characters, all based around the metal elements here. Each of them given their own characteristics, lead obviously being a bit kind of heavier and stockier, etc. And Metal Men became a successful comic. And what I want to mention here is that very often, even though they were playful and bizarre, there would often be scientific explanations. Even in this, there's actually quite a bit of information. I can be hammered into a sheet of 4/millionths of an inch. So these kind of facts would get through to their young readers. We know that many young readers would have learnt some of their first scientific facts, probably taken them to school and surprised their teachers with what they'd read in Metal Men or Flash, for example. And these comics did tap into that scientific era, the space age, the fascination of science in the early 60s. Right. And this is a member of the Legion of Superheroes. This is a character called Chemical King, who is not exactly, again, a very major character, but I put him in because here, for example, he actually is able to speed up his metabolism, use my chemical reaction power, and I can make myself 100 times stronger, but obviously only for a period of time. I'll burn up my body's energy reserves in seconds, so he comes to the rescue at this point. And this is actually from a guide to all the characters. If you really want to get that interested and that fanatical about these comics, you can actually learn about their height and weight and goodness knows what else about them. Chemical King, again, a slightly forgotten character, but one of this vast intergalactic team of superheroes, Legion of Superheroes. Of the Marvel characters, and we could bring in many, I've mentioned Mr. Fantastic already, Spider-Man with the radioactive spider, I guess that connects into chemistry as well, but I always thought that Daredevil's origin is the one that is particularly focusing on chemicals and chemistry, because of course it's actually some sinister, toxic waste which is about to topple over a blind man, very appropriately, very ironically, and these very barrels end up, a young Matt Murdock saves this man by pushing him out of the way and ends up getting covered in these chemicals. Radiation, of course, is another very strong theme in almost all of the Marvel superhero characters. One has to think of the Hulk, for example, or Spider-Man, as I mentioned earlier. And in this case, Matt Murdock, the young Matt Murdock, finds that when he awakes in hospital, that in fact his other senses have been heightened. And this gives him it's a very interesting idea that without vision, even so, that he would be able to operate, in fact, almost at a more advanced state than a normal human being. So in that sense, it could be seen as somewhat an empowering message for people who were blind or are blind. He became the man without fear. And one of the interesting way the comics actually worked is the way they portrayed the way he sensed things. They would actually, for example, they would show heartbeats so that he could hear if someone was lying, for example. Or they would have to visualize the way he was seeing internally. And Daredevil itself is a character that's about to come back onto our TV screens, or onto our TV screens for the first time. There's a new TV series being prepared for that, which hopefully will also be able to convey this particular superhero's powers. And I think actually he remains for me one of the most interesting ones because of that fragility, that he doesn't have sight, and he's also one of the most kind of grounded, even though he leaps about the air, of course, the most grounded superhero because he works in the real city of New York, and he deals with people's problems. As a lawyer, he has another sort of fulfilling career as well. Whoops, that went too quickly. Right, I'm going to just drop over the channel because we've looked a lot, of course, at America, and I could have brought more things in also from UK comics, but I wanted to bring in two interesting scientists with obviously a chemical bent to them from French comics. This is the Belgian series Spirou, that's the character in the red outfit just there, not very well known over here, but massive in Belgium. So there's still a weekly comic being published starring him, and this is the Count de Champignac, which of course is a play on champignon, as in mushroom. And in Champignac, he has his own vast laboratory. He's basically a savant. He knows all kinds of things, including chemistry. Here he's received a new species of mushroom from a Swedish specialist in Stockholm and is about to develop a new scientific experiment. This particular story is a particularly bizarre one because it's called The Black Ray, Le Rayon Noir, which ends up turning people's skin color black. And it's a sort of slightly topical comment on racism and what would happen if you were suddenly to change the color of your skin temporarily through scientific means. And of course, the other most famous Belgian or Franco-Belgian scientist character, of course, is Professor Calculus, who was inspired, as I've said here, by Auguste Piccard. He obviously built wonderful machinery for Tintin and Captain Haddock. He's, of course, a scientist involved with the famous Moon 2-album storyline that Hergé created. But one of his less famous inventions is a drug to discourage alcoholism. And this probably is a chemical which exists, I suspect. I mean, somebody in the audience will know about this more than I do. But this was, of course, to counter Captain Haddock's pretty much incurable love of whiskey. And it apparently did work in the comic anyway. So that's Professor Calculus. Now, those are all very, very, they're fanciful, they have some more or less scientific elements, but I'm showing you some things that you might not be so familiar with now. I actually love these things. These are sort of they can be slightly po-faced, and they don't realize quite how bizarre they are. And as Ben mentioned, I did do a book called The Leather Nun and Other Incredibly Strange Comics. And there is a comic called The Leather Nun, and in there we put some wonderful comics like The Truth About Prunes, for example, which I think you've got to read a comic about the truth because they're fascinating. You can talk about anything in a comic, and here we've got amazing but true facts about milk and milk protection. I'm very excited with a cheery milk lady on the front there, a cowherd, whatever, on the front with her stuff. And in here, it explains, it's done, of course, it's produced by a milk corporation in America in the 50s. Many of these were produced and were given away free as advertising, but also as educational stuff. And this explains, for example, there, the Louis Pasteur with his pasteurization. It's all to do with how milk was made increasingly safe and, of course, also bottled and commercially made available. New system in America of these special seal-right, double-capping milk protection tops. Very exciting comics. It's almost so unexciting that it becomes sort of interesting in a way, I think, because you've never seen comics quite like this. And this kind of diagrammatical approach to comics is, I think, used a lot. The superhero is often brought in for this to kind of make it a bit more exciting and zesty and interesting. This was done by Sinclair. I've checked; they still are one of America's private oil companies, and they're in the Midwest. And here, in the early 50s or so, they developed a new rust-inhibiting additive called RD119, and Miraclo is the superhero who appears here to explain the benefits of this particular equipment, and as you can see here, to actually reduce the characters, the ordinary human characters, down to miniature size, including the dog, and whisk them inside the petrol tank, from which they can then see the effects of rust and how RD119 is going to reverse this. And then later on, they are in the Sinclair labs here with a scientist explaining the whole process of what goes on. In fact, this additive apparently did work. It isn't, of course, rust is not caused by gasoline, but it is actually something that's a problem within cars, and this particular brand of Sinclair Petroleum continues to this day promoting this feature. So it's that one, there we go. This is about Rayon. Well, why not? Yes, a comic about Rayon. There was actually a very interesting comic you can see there called True Comics. There were so many. There was one called Science Comics as well. These are the 10-cent pulp comics of the 1940s, and many of this story would have first appeared there, and that mixed biographical stories, science stories, geography stories, all kinds of factual comics. This is, of course, though promoted, it's been reprinted essentially by the American Viscose Corporation, who obviously have a vested interest in getting us all to wear rayon. Is anybody wearing rayon? I'm not. I don't think anybody wears rayon, but this believed that the entire future would be basically made of rayon. Certainly we'd all be using it in every possible product. But along the way, you learn things. You learn about the invention of cellulose here, for example, and it's made as interesting as it can be, I suppose. Given the limited potential, perhaps, for exciting storytelling of innovation here. But here we have the swan's wife crocheting doilies from discarded filaments, and this gives Swan the idea to actually make fabrics from those filaments and lead to more artificial man-made fibers. And of course, the scientist very often is presented in this very kind of quite heroic role. This is, as I say, very much the 50s, very much the idea that, we've exploded bombs, we've won the war. America in particular was very, very optimistic about science, as of course were we in Britain. One only has to think of science as it was presented often in Eagle comic, the British comic for boys, which is again in a very positive and educational way. And this is a vision of the future where literally almost everybody is wearing and using rayon. The young boy complains about rayon being sissy stuff, but father says, hold on, son, what about this sturdy rug? Wool, mohair, and rayon. And there's rayon in your football pants, and believe it or not, in your shoe lining. Well, that's me converted, isn't it? I mean, come on. Go and buy some rayon. And I love this. It's the most beautiful image of, the visionary scientist, chemist there at work. As it says, yes, today's rayon is far stronger, longer wearing, and more beautiful than yesterday's, but tomorrow's rayon will be even more perfect, for scientists will build it that way. Wonderful, wonderfully kind of stirring and inspiring comic book. A modern comic in this same kind of style is a bit more playful, a bit more interesting in terms of its presentation and its analysis of things. This actually is a fascinating comic about stem cell research, Hope Not Hype, which I came across. And there are many uses of comics today. People have come back to this format of saying, well, how do we get across to people? How do we communicate these complicated subjects clearly and accessibly? And comics are so useful for such a way of doing it. There are many reasons for that. Partly, if you have to think about it, is that with a comic, you're not just presented with a fleeting, ephemeral video image, which you might have on a video or a TV show or something. It's there, it's fixed on the page. You're reading and you're looking. And what's been found is that people don't read comics perhaps in the way you might imagine. People don't just say, start top left if you're reading a Western comic anyway, top left and go one at a time and simply proceed in a kind of very systematic way. They look around a lot. There's a lot of eye movement, a lot of connecting, a lot of looking back. It's a much more intuitive and involving and participative way of reading than many people assume. And of course, the theory behind comics is that you show, don't tell. In theory, there's no reason to, for example, it's the most banal thing, have somebody walking into this room and then say in the caption, and then so-and-so walked into the room. You don't need to show that. And this allows you to do this multi-tracking. What you show can be saying or communicating one thing. The text can communicate something else, perhaps even not necessarily in harmony or in sync. It can counterpoint, it can contrast, it can actually do more. And this multi-tracking of the language of comics has been used by a great many creators in the last 20, 30 years in graphic novels, to the point where people have tried to adapt these sophisticated kinds of comics into movies, for example. And of course, it's very hard to do this. It's very hard for us to multi-track and also to get out of that linear, progressive roller coaster ride of, for example, a film or a TV program. In comics, you're actually a free agent. You're directing, animating, literally making, almost performing the comic. One artist, Chris Ware, who won the Guardian Prize in 2000 for the first novel prize, I should say, for Jimmy Corrigan, has likened comics to sheet music. In other words, they don't really exist. They don't come alive until you read them and you animate them, you perform them. They are rather like that. They're cues, they're signals that you animate. Anyway, this is one example of the uses of comics at the moment too, for educational purposes, for all kinds of institutions. And I think it's a very important growth of comics, a recognition of their value. Here's a fun thing. I saw that downstairs, of course, you've got a periodic table on the wall, but I think it should be one of these as well. This is all the elements, but they're all turned into superhero characters. I'm afraid I don't have any more information about them all. They're not existing ones, they're made up ones. The characters relate more or less to the elements. And this artist, Mark Tomczak, has come up with flashcards and ways of using it. So a way of learning the product table, also a way of engaging with it and imagining stories of the characters interacting. And along that way, he also picked up minerals here and gave them, again, personified them as superhero characters, super minerals, depending on their hardness, from talc up to diamond, for example. I think just a very nice, inventive way of combining cartooning and science in an enjoyable way. The scale of the success of this kind of educational comic is remarkable too. This is a series that's come out in Korea. I had a chance to go to Korea a few years back, and this is, of course, South Korea, and their market is extraordinary. It's very rich, very particularly keen on, of course, as you may know, Korea's got a very high level of education amongst its young people, and it's very aware that comics are a vital way of getting young people to engage with scientific subjects. So this whole series of why comics, you can see, has been a huge success, and one hopes that eventually it might get published perhaps in English. It's a very entertaining and enjoyable way of understanding. In this case, it's all about food, of course, and nutrition, explained with cartoon characters. I also came across this, which is Lucky Star is a very, very cute manga series with an anime, as you may know, animation to go with it. And they too have combined the comics approach with chemistry. This is a particular special book of about nearly 400 pages. It's got a lot of real content, as in serious textual content, but also has fun comics as well. I can show you a spread from it just here. And it has all of the various characters from Lucky Star animating the story and engaging with the reader. It's done in this preference here to this language of moe. Moe is basically a sort of variation on the word kawaii, which means cute. Basically, they're characters that are kind of made into this slightly strange, distorted form with big eyes and smaller bodies. And it's all very, very charming and cute and sweet, mostly with pretty girls as you can see. But what a wonderful way to learn chemistry. I mean, I'd learn chemistry using that, wouldn't you? I mean, yeah. So, tremendous. And in a more sort of more serious level, I'm also very excited about the graphic novel format, the more kind of serious graphic novel format. I'm going to show you a couple from France here, which I think are remarkable. These are biographical comics, graphic biographies. This is Fritz Haber, who you may know about. Quite a complex person, obviously, because on the one hand, he was a German scientist developing, amongst other things, poisonous gases, chlorine, and other terrible, death-bringing devices, weapons that were used by the Germans in the Great War, in the First World War. But he was also Jewish, which makes things even more complicated. And his life story is being produced in some, I think it's going to be a five-volume series of graphic novels, beautifully illustrated by a chap called David van der Merlen, who's Belgian. And this is actually a sequence where Haber is told about the first time they're going to be testing his gases on the front line. And he's actually, and of course it's going to be at Ypres in France. And he's actually not very keen on this, particularly it being the first place for it to be tested. He's not happy about as he mentions, the topography and the weather conditions won't be favourable. But he's this is showing, I suppose, some reserve and some doubts about what effect it's going to have in testing these devices, these terrible gases. But in the end, he's cajoled and forced into accepting this. This is what they will have to be tested there, because they intend to use these gases to make a very powerful strike and to defeat the French in this test. So anyway, that's part of that graphic novel biography, and I think it's not unfortunately in English yet, partly I suspect because it's not actually complete, but when the whole thing is complete, I expect somebody will bring it out in some big, complete volume, and it will be a really worthwhile graphic novel to see. Marie Curie's life has also been portrayed in many comics. In fact, I couldn't find a scan of the one I'd found in a lovely girls' comic, which was rather short, only about 2 pages, rather condensed, has to be said. This is a full-length graphic novel by a female artist, woman artist in France, Chantal Montelier, a very well-produced book. And I thought I'd read this one out, though, because this is quite fun. This is actually from Randall Munro, who was over here just a little while ago, who's doing some great experimental web comics on XKCD. So, I'll read this out to you. It just says, my teacher always told me that if I applied myself, I could become the next Marie Curie. Well, I wish they'd get over me. Zombie Marie Curie. Not that I don't deserve it. These 2 Nobels ain't decorative, but I made a sorry role model if girls just see me over and over as the one token lady scientist. Lise Meitner figured out that the nuclear fission was happening while her colleague Otto was staring blankly at their data in confusion, and proved Enrico Fermi wrong in the process. Enrico and Otto both got Nobel Prizes. Lisa got a National Women's Press Club Award. They finally named an element after her, but not till 60 years later. Emmy, how do you pronounce that? Noether, probably, or Noether, probably Noether. M.A. Noether fought past her Victorian era finishing school upbringing, pursued mathematics by auditing classes, and after finally getting a PhD, was permitted to teach only as an unpaid lecturer, often under male colleagues' names. Was she as good as them? She revolutionized abstract algebra, filled gaps in relativity, and found what some call the most beautiful, deepest result in theoretical physics. Oh, but you don't become great by trying to be great. You become great by wanting to do something and then doing it so hard that you become great in the process. So don't try to be the next me, Noether or Meitner. Just remember that if you want to do this stuff, you're not alone. Thanks. Also, avoid radium. Turns out it kills you. I'll try. Great stuff. And that, of course, is actually almost the complete opposite of what I just showed you with that beautifully, lushly illustrated Marie Curie or the Haber biography, these beautifully painted European graphic novels. It's very simplistically drawn, stick figures, but Munro is a brilliant writer and a brilliant comic artist, and his stuff's reaching lots of people, of course, through the internet as the web expands its reach. And I'm going to end, I think, with this one. This is a particular favorite of mine. I'm researching right now a new book about manga, about comics from Japan. This is a big enough subject to do another whole talk just about that and science. But this is a marvelously creative comic. Moyasimon, actually in English it was called Moyasimon Tales of Agriculture. Yes. And it was bought by young kids, because many young kids are buying manga because they love it, and they often come to discover it perhaps through the anime version. There was an animated version of Moyasimon. And it's about a college student who has the unique power to be able to actually see germs and microbes and bacteria around him and sort of communicate with them. And this tapped into a fascinating area of Japanese culture, probably not just of Japanese culture. We all have a certain kind of nervousness about germs and what they're doing and where they're lurking. And it was also probably around the time when this first began that we had the rise of the antibacterial hand wash, which we're all going, I mean, at one point we're all being told to wash our hands almost continuously. And the whole fear of bacteria being something nasty. And of course, Japan is, I think, proud of being really a very cleanly nation. They're very, very, this place isn't clean enough, I'm sorry. They would be very fussy about spotless cleaning and hygiene. So in many ways, there was a lot of misunderstanding about how important bacteria and germs and microbes are in so many ways, even, for example, in the preparation of food, when he has to think of tofu, for example, or the fermented products, which were a mystery to many Japanese young people, even probably adults. So this character here, for example, all of the germs, as you saw just there, are personified. They're all turned into these wonderfully cute characters. It's almost like a kind of mixture of chemistry and Pokemon, perhaps, I suppose, or biology and Pokemon anyway. And you can see some of them actually are lurking in the comic as they would do, as they are around us all the time right now, with little footnotes on the side here. You can see there one there is R. Javanicus is being explained. They all have slightly different colours and shapes to them. And our hero character here is able to see them. Here, this particular storyline involves somebody actually needing to raise some money. His fellow sort of dorm mates at the agriculture university need to raise some money fast, and they believe they can tap into his superpower, his ability to communicate with microbes, to make penicillin. As being a way to at least make some money. He's not sure about whether that's really practical, to catch them one by one and put them into a petri dish, as it says just here. But we can sell pure chrysogenium to the research labs, and their idea is they can make some money by selling absolutely pure, perfect penicillin from his expertise, from his ability to see these germs all around him. So that, I think, to me, is an interesting example to end on in a way, because what we've got here is we've gone through some really fanciful and frankly rather ridiculous characters when he has to think about the human bomb, but doesn't learn an awful lot perhaps about science from that, except it's probably not a power that you and I want to acquire at any point. On the other hand, with something like these very dry, scientific, very factual comics, they can be a little bit heavy going, and you can have a sense of humour about them, but you can learn, but they're not really made entertaining. And somehow for me, I think very often it's this interesting mixture of the entertaining and the educational that this represents that I think is a way to engage and to animate people's imaginations about science and chemistry in particular. So I think that's where I'm going to end at the moment. How have we gone on? Well, we've done all right, haven't we? Yes, we have. And I think we're going to have a little chat, aren't we? And some Q&A as well with you, I hope. So thank you very much. I'm just going to put this last little sign up, which will come up, I think, there we are, which is my website. Terrible advertising, sorry about that. I will change it, but I thought just in case you want to find out more, because I'm passionate about comics, and I do lots of events, and there are lots of exhibitions going on, not just the Comics on Master One, there are other things happening. And if you're curious about this world and want to step a bit more into it and explore it, this is quite an interesting portal for you to discover. Good, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we can afford to leave the gratuitous plug up
Could
there
we?
for a little bit
Oh, a
longer,
little
can
while,
we?
anyway, yes.
Does anybody have any questions? We still have a few minutes yet. There are a couple of roving microphones, so if you do have any questions, please just put your hand up and we'll make sure somebody gets to you so that we can all hear what your questions are. If anybody could put their hand up. Nothing.
Yes,
right, we have one down here. Well, while we're waiting for the microphone to get to you, but one question I had.
Oh, yes.
You talked about the sort of continuity and the way that things have changed over time. Do you think comics use that as a way to change history? And the example I'm thinking of is with Spider-Man, who was originally bitten by a radioactive spider.
Yes.
But now if you read that story, he was bitten by a genetically modified spider instead.
Well, these stories can always be kind of like deepened, can't they? I mean, obviously, we didn't even know about genetics, I don't think, very much back in 1963 when he began, or even 62, I think. But, anyway, but yes, you're right. And there's a way, that is the fascinating thing about these stories, is that they can be, there's always little spaces where you can assert an extra element, an extra depth to it. And I think I think the challenge, though, is simply that for many people in the audience who don't love comics quite as much as you and I do, they go, but which one's the real story, which one's the right story? And we are at the point where it is like almost becoming too confusing to kind of figure out what is the official story. And every so often they have these vast events where characters are wiped out and it's all kind of made simpler and there's one continuity. And right now DC has 52 different Earths, doesn't it? Just 52, which is curious really, that the entire cosmos should happen to have the same number of planets, of Earths, as days of the week on this one. Makes no sense at all, of course. But this may, again, I think, be a temporary kind of aberration expansion. So it's in constant flux. But yeah, I think what it is clever when people spot little ways of adding an extra element and modernizing it, because of course these stories are also continually being modernized. They are sort of somewhat out of time. We're not really in the early 60s anymore when Peter Parker gets bitten. We're in whatever time frame it needs to be to make some sense for the character to be up to date. So that, again, is going to shift things along all the time.
I imagine that can help to reflect modern cultural concerns as well, because people aren't quite as worried about radiation as they were in the 60s.
No.
But people are very concerned about genetic modification. And
Absolutely.
may well be in 5-10 years' time another concern. Perhaps nanotechnology will be the next rewriting of Spider-Man's history.
And I suspect this also gives people the chance to, the writers and artists, to say, well, what would that do to Spider-Man? I mean, he's not just radiation. He's got, presumably he might be poisoned, of course, but that that genetic thing might mean that he starts to sprout maybe a pair of arms or turn into a spider or something. So there's enormous, any opportunity to somehow keep these stories going is going to be grabbed, I can assure you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Did we manage to get a microphone to you, sir?
Here we go.
You mentioned British comics in passing.
I did rather in passing. I know. I realise it's a bit American here, isn't it? Yes.
But I wonder if you've come across any writers of the American comics similar to Chad Varra, who I believe wrote Down There, and was a qualified physicist.
Right.
And also, can I have a second thing?
Yeah.
And that is that why it is that British comics never seem to have had any impact on film or television in the way that the American ones have.
The Chad Varra question is interesting, and it doesn't immediately make me go, I'm going to think of someone that's quite like him, because he was also, wasn't he the founder of the Samaritans, wasn't he, of course, as well? And again, and Eagle is something that if I could have done a whole section on that, absolutely. And you probably read Eagle, didn't you? Yeah, so you can come up here and tell us about it. But did they have scientist hero characters? I mean, obviously, within Down There, of course, most importantly, they had Professor Peabody, an interesting surname, if you realise that she ends up being a woman, which was a big surprise to most readers at that time. And she was one of the few, strong female characters, knowledgeable role models, if you like, for women in British comics at that point. But I'm trying to think, I can't think, if you think about it, you see the equivalent in America, you're saying, to Chad Varra. I'm writer. Yeah, I can't think of anyone right off the top of my head at the moment that would be quite in that same position. But the writers who've come into comics are interesting. One of the most interesting, perhaps, that could be a parallel is William Moulton Marston, that was his pen name, who was the inventor of Wonder Woman. And what's interesting about him is that he did have a very strong, sort of engaged political conscience of trying to change the way that women were perceived and the way that the comics up to that time had been almost entirely male superheroes with just brute force being their main fundamental weapon. And Moulton Marston was also the inventor of the lie detector. And there are several new books coming out around this whole area because he lived in a fascinating menage a trois with a wife and a mistress, the mistress being more of the model, I suspect, for Wonder Woman than his wife. And all sorts of interesting bondage questions come into it as well, because bondage is used as a symbol in the comic in quite overt ways of the domination of women, and then women's Wonder Woman has in fact a lasso, which if she spins around you will then make you say the truth, for example. So all sorts of, so there's a lot of interesting elements to that writer. And I think certainly there would be examples of people in American comics wanting to write very vocational and educational and religiously inspiring comics, which of course is really what was underlying a lot of the comics in Eagle. In America, for example, there was a Catholic comic magazine called Treasure Chest, which ran a lot of those kinds of lives of the saints and educational stuff. And inspiring comics, in many ways a model of Eagle. And when I showed Tintin, Tintin magazine, the weekly Tintin that began in 1946, we know was a model for Eagle, because Tintin, for example, made his first appearance in Eagle in 1951 before it appeared in book form, and we know they were looking at it as an alternative to the cheap, shoddily produced American comics. Tintin was beautifully printed, beautifully illustrated, and of course quite religious and educational, Catholic background. So that was a model for Eagle. Yeah. Good. We've got some more questions. Some at the back, some at the front.
If we get a mic to Duncan down. Oh, someone at the back, and then to Duncan afterwards.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Please go ahead.
That's good.
Can you comment? I mean, when I was a teenager and younger, I used to read a lot of comics, especially the Marvel, DC. Whether apart from informing the public and highlighting scientific issues, whether also there's a sort of a moral message, like fighting evil, good always prevails, and so on.
True. Yes. Was that a question or a statement?
Yeah. No. I mean, can you comment that?
Yeah. I guess.
Apart from informing and highlighting issues, there's a moral
suppose
message.
maybe I touched on that a little bit by saying about all the optimism in the 60s of science. And I suppose what's happened, the word I haven't used in that talk was the word mad scientist. We showed obviously calculus is a bit dotty, but he's not maniacal. And one could easily go over to that kind of that portrayal where you have somebody, I'm going to blow up the world, and etc. So that's the negative side, which of course is there all the way through. In so many of these comics. Dr. Doom, now was he a scientist? He was with Reed Richards, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He was.
And he's also, in theory, disfigured. Dr. Doom, of course, wears this sort of iron mask kind of character, but we don't know if it's really disfigured, do we? Because he might be actually perfectly all right, but might just have a tiny blemish, which has just distorted his whole personality into making him into a supervillain.
Did
you know about that?
There's the Green Goblin as well, who was a research scientist who ultimately uses his research in order to try and kill off Spider-Man.
And again, wearing a mask. But he's not disfigured, I don't think, is he?
He's a goblin.
Goblin, of course. Of course he is. How stupid of him.
And another interesting example in terms of depictions of scientists, actually, is in the backstory of Swamp Thing. And the Swamp Thing's had his backstory changed a number of times, most recently by Alan Moore, and that one is a little more sort of fantastic.
We should explain that, though, shouldn't we? Though it's incredible. I can visualize. I'm actually on Earl's Court Tube Station right now, reading The Anatomy Lesson by Alan Moore, which is the first time this British writer Alan Moore had taken on a character. And up until that point, Swamp Thing had just been what you'd expect it to be, which is like this shambling monster made from a soup of chemicals that comes out of the swamp. And of course, it's always going on about, I must get back to being human again. And you thought, well, that's kind of like, okay, we've kind of heard that a few times. And what the astonishing thing that Alan came up with was the idea that this is not actually a human being that's been transformed or that could go back to being human. It's actually a vegetable imagining, sort of remembering, thinking itself to be a human form of vegetation, essentially.
The personified spirit of the swamp.
Yes.
Sort of
in fact, it becomes exactly, in nature, it becomes kind of like a green man or this guy. And I can remember the shock revelation by the end of that first story that you realise he wasn't human anymore. Not a question of going back to being human. He simply was not. He was now vegetable matter. Which is just amazingly. And that, again, is what can be done, as you might point out. These characters can sort of lumber along sometimes in mediocre hands, and suddenly can come along and go, well, you haven't thought about this little tweak, this little window of opportunity to suddenly make the story deeper and richer. So that's a good example.
In his very original story, he was developing a formula in order to make plants grow in the desert, and actually he was injured in a lab accident set off by a competitor, but not a competitor in science, a competitor in love, who wanted to steal his wife, and so set up this lab accident. But then later, when it was reimagined, he was a competitor in science, and it was somebody trying to steal the formula because he knew he could make more money from it, and that then triggers the escape into the swamp covered in mysterious chemicals, a la the Flash. And so the depictions of scientists are not always positive, and many times the scientists science is being used for evil ends.
Yeah, definitely.
Duncan?
Thank you, Paul. That was a great talk. I was interested when you showed the Flash strip, and it was the reflash in a sense.
The what, sorry?
He was reading a comic about an earlier Flash,
exactly,
so a little bit self-referential. But I was wondering if the same had happened in science, almost that actually someone reading a comic book depiction of fantastical science has that at the back of his or her mind and actually pursues a career trying to make that real in materials or something else.
I would love to know more examples of that. The ones that I do know a little bit about are in Japan, where we know that a lot of people working in robotics grew up reading particularly Astro Boy by Osamu Tezuka, and that this was the start of their thinking, their dreaming of that. And we know that that's happened to other people, and we know that Tintin certainly has inspired no end of different vocations through his albums. So, yeah, I don't know of any other examples. Do you know of any examples?
Well, we were discussing earlier. There is a story that may be apocryphal.
Oh, yes, you did mention this.
That there was an old Spider-Man storyline where Spider-Man, unbeknownst to him, was being tracked by having a radio tag placed on him by the villain du jour. And it said that there was a judge whose son was particularly interested in comics and was a fan of Spider-Man, and the judge had seen this. And this was in the 70s in America.
So his son has explained it to him.
Yeah, and his son had explained what had happened. And the judge thought, well, that might work quite well for low-level criminals who we don't want to put in jail, but we do want to understand where they are. And so the idea is that Spider-Man inspired the theory behind electronic tagging of criminals. And that may be apocryphal, but it fits very nicely with the timing, and it's the sort of thing where science fiction, they do say science equals science fiction plus time, and there's a lot of science fiction in comics in order to inspire that sort of thing.
There's certainly plenty of things that, of course, that are predicted in comics over the years, even down to Dick Tracy's wrist televisions and this kind of thing, which we now have.
And there's Batman's shark repellent spray as well, which has become a byword for ridiculous things in comics and graphic novels.
Well, it's what's particularly being such a convenient Deus Ex Machina to beat when you're because obviously Batman's utility belt has got a lot in it. Basically, it must be. In fact, he must weigh a ton, mustn't it? I mean,
well, he also has an anti-gravity ray, which presumably keeps it light.
That helps. That helps.
But it turns out the more we understand about the way that animals communicate, the more it is actually plausible, and there are people who are attempting to market shark repellent sprays that will put pheromones out that would put a shark off or would confuse their senses in such a way as to not allow them to follow a trail of blood, for example. So it has become a byword for ridiculous elements of science fiction, might actually be perfectly plausible.
I suspect some of the things I have shown that probably aren't plausible at all. That was my one sort of question for anybody, because you know a lot more about chemistry. I mean, vast amounts more about chemistry than I do, and science. So I just wondered, could anyone would like to contribute to say, well, that's possible. I mean, for example, could chemicals make your body elastic? Probably not. But I mean, I know probably I can't possibly bring this up. I'm experimenting at the moment. But I just wondered, some of you out there that know much, I'd love to know what some of these ridiculous ideas. I mean, less ridiculous, perhaps, it seems to me, is and when I like Daredevil, I mentioned Daredevil, is because in theory you can heighten your senses do become heightened if you become blind, and you could, in theory, enhance that in some way, perhaps. But I'll leave it with you. I won't put you on the spot. But you can come up to me discreetly or email me through my website and tell me what you're experimenting on.
We had a question at the back there?
Yeah, more of a comment than a question. I was reading the paper, I heard in the news yesterday about Professor Stephen Hawking, and we know he speaks through his electronics. And the comment was that he's made a comment that in 100 years' time, the artificial intelligence will take over from human intelligence, and humans will die out. I mean, there's no guarantee for any species that we're going to last. Just wondering whether you've heard of it and what your views would be on it, because it seems to be on the same sort of deal. That technology marches on. Can it march beyond us?
It's certainly been as a topic that's been done in science fiction and science fiction comics, and whether we will survive and whether robots will inherit. When he has to think of WALL-E, doesn't we? That wonderful film that says many of the same things as that. Yeah, I can't really have much more comment to that, I don't think, except that it's a question that's certainly been dealt with very well in comics over many years.
In particular, there's an author called Grant Morrison.
Oh yeah, we should mention him.
Who does a lot of very sort of fantastic, quite surrealist comics. But he has explored the idea of what we've come to call the singularity, the point at which technology becomes better at designing technology than humans are. And the idea is that at that point there will be exponential development in technology, we will lose control. And one of the nice things about comics, graphic novels and science fiction in general is that actually his work allows us to explore the the social and moral implications of that in a way that we can't do by discussing the science purely and on its own. So he can put forward situations that have these sort of ambiguous moral questions. I'm not sure if you've read Transmetropolitan as well.
I know that one. That's excellent too.
Which,
Yeah,
again, set in the future and does the same sort of thing, puts forward very interesting ideas. I think my favourite in that regard from Transmetropolitan is that there's a whole issue in the future of people who have been cryogenically frozen because they were ill, then being woken up and treated, and there is essentially immigration from the past. And these people don't really fit in anymore because the world has moved on so much. And again, it's a scientific issue, but the comics and the situation, the framework, allows us to explore the moral aspects of it, which I think is quite powerful.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, Judge Dredd we ought to mention. We haven't perhaps given quite enough credit to British comics tonight. I mean, that is extraordinary. It's 1977, still doing very strong, clever, engaging, and quite provocative storylines about where we're going in the future. As we all know, I mean, the best science fiction is about now, just extrapolating from where we are now and warning us perhaps as to what we might be heading towards. But thank you. That's a very good point to raise that prediction. Yeah.
Any more questions out there?
Over
we
here.
have one
Oh,
over
thank you.
here, if we can get a microphone to... Meanwhile, I'll ask something else that I've been thinking of. What is it about comics that gives them their power? So they're clearly a tool for education. They're a tool for, the quotes I had up at the beginning, a tool for sort of social literacy, for teaching about health effects and so on. Why are they more powerful? Why are they used more?
Well, I've always thought so we can do a hell of a lot with words, obviously, because we've been talking away this evening, and we can do a lot with pictures, and just go to an art gallery or whatever. But you put them together, and you can do more. That just seems to be, it's simple maths, really, isn't it? Pictures plus words equals something more than they are individually. And it's an art form that I think really does get into your head. I find, how much can I admit about this? I'm a little bit underwhelmed by TV and movies and things at the moment. I'm even a little bit underwhelmed by theatre. I've seen some good things, but it's just the artifice of it and the manipulativeness of it, manipulation of these mediums. We're going to make you cry. We're going to have a big sweeping orchestra. We're going to have a giant projection of somebody blubbing their eyes out very well. I mean, in the next scene, when they've cut, they'll go off and they'll just go and have a cigarette or have a hamburger. But the point is that they're there and they're making you feel, and you go, oh, I'm there. But comics can't do that. Comics, they struggle to make you emote. But when they do engage you, I think they're tremendously powerful. And I like to be in control of what I'm thinking about and seeing and analysing. I don't just want to be swept along by some, the director. Director isn't the word for Führer, basically. A director directs, not just the actors. He's directing your attention, your brainwaves, your emotions. It's all you're going to that darkened room, or whatever you are. So I don't like that. I know I kind of can see where it's going. Comics continue to surprise me. I wouldn't be talking like I am now, and you wouldn't certainly be reading them either, if you thought, well, they've done it all. You've seen it, done it. Which we kind of, sort of feel a little bit. I do. About quite a lot of TV and genre stuff, and it's not as ebullient and effervescent as comics are right now. Partly because they've been held back. They've been held back by being stuck certainly in the West, as being for kids or in set genres, or having, much as we love them, characters that can never die. It's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be going back to Japanese comics, to manga, because that is an extraordinary. We've got Japanese people maybe in the audience, or manga fans. I know who you are, but because their comics have just been able to become a huge amount of a part of everyday life in every form, to the point where they're great. They have a writer artist called Osamu Tezuka, who's hailed as the god of manga. He has his own one-man museum, and he said this wonderful phrase: "We're living in the age of comics as air." And I think, my gosh, I want to go and breathe that air, because it's true, because they are in every form. I've only shown a little glimpse of things, but they can spin off into everything. And they inform everything, connect to everything. And my current project is trying to figure out why has that happened there, and could it happen elsewhere, and what makes it so special. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Your question.
Oh, yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned earlier Dick Tracy's wristwatch with the television, and obviously today it's a reality. I was just wondering, it gave me a thought that perhaps we should be tapping into comic writers for innovation and future inventions. I just wanted to know what your opinion on that
Very
was,
good
and
idea.
if it's happening.
I think it should be happening. It might even be an interesting project to to develop, actually, because the most fanciful ideas often do end up being reality. The great phrase, of course, is that, what's the title of that Tom Gold book? Oh, yes. It's the future and where's my jetpack, I think, or something like that. It's basically, we haven't, of course, some things haven't come true. We aren't all, if you look at the wonderful images of the future that were imagined in the late Victorian era, or by Jules Verne, for example, or Robbie Dow, or other people, we haven't got there. The future, often we get it wrong, don't we? We kind of don't get there. But as we've said, a great many scientists, inventors do consume science fiction as much as science fact and take inspiration from it. Yeah, and I'm thinking, well, have you seen anything that makes you go that a comic has predicted something that we haven't got yet, that we might have, that we will have in the future?
Well, we're getting quite close to developing gecko foot technology that would allow you to climb a wall like Spider-Man. Through understanding the physics of what's going on there, and certainly people
because geckos only have some kind of extraordinary extra.
It's essentially hairs upon hairs upon hairs.
Exactly. Yes.
So you get
to grip onto almost anything. The tiniest
large
things.
Van der Waals forces between whatever your special hairy surface is and the real surface. And actually the beautiful thing about this is a paper that demonstrated this, that I think was published in Science, used a plastic Spider-Man model as its example of a weight that this could hold onto glass.
Perfect. Right.
So those technologies are on their way, I think.
Yeah. I'm sure we have that to look forward to.
Yes,
exactly.
Very much so. The metamaterials that develop invisibility, especially against things like radar, are certainly well on their way. Yes, we have another question down the front, if we could. Thank you. Delightful hat as well.
The gecko feet thing have already been created. And on the news, there's been reports of them doing these tests of them climbing glass.
Is that real people climbing glass with them? Wow. And it supported them. And they haven't just been, they've been real, it's not adults in other words. That's amazing, right? So Spider-Man becomes real, or Gecko Man, I think. If there isn't one, we need to get that one up, I think. I forget Gecko Man.
Well, yes. Leading on from geckos, of course, regeneration often happens in comics as well. It's the sort of thing that stem cell surgery could get us towards.
Absolutely, that might very well be on the horizon. Yeah, so we might be. So to keep ahead of it is going to be the challenge.
Yes.
I mean, just recently William Gibson was over, wasn't he, and with a new book, and I'm interested to see how he's still reimagining or newly imagining where we're heading, because we've kind of caught up with what he was imagining already, and that's always difficult, perhaps even more difficult now with science advancing, accelerating so much, to be able to be ahead and to come up with imaginative other visions of the future. But I think comics will deliver.
I think, I guess one more quick example.
Oh yeah, do we? Yeah.
Certainly the origin of the Silver Surfer shows the planet that he originally came from, where they have
Zenlar.
That's it, where they have levitating trains. We do now have maglev trains, certainly in Japan, and as we get closer to room temperature superconductivity, we are likely to see more levitating trains. But the origin of Silver Surfer was a long time before maglev trains actually existed.
That's an interesting one.
That
probably
predictive power of comics.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been. Good.
Do we have any more questions? I think we probably have time for one more. And we have a question towards the back there.
Hello
if we
there.
could get a microphone to the gentleman at the back.
Have any comic strips taken up the theme of the mad professor who accidentally discovered flubber?
Oh, flubber! Well, that was a Disney movie, wasn't it? And I think it was based on. Was it based on a children's book? I think it might have been based on a children's book originally. I think it was. Yes.
I'm not sure.
And all I know with Flubber is that there's definitely a Flubber adaptation of the movie, but I'm not sure if it was spun off into any more stories. But yeah, there are certainly plenty of mad scientists in comics, going right back to the early years in newspaper strips. I'm trying to think whether anything that's actually on at the moment that particularly covers that area. But of course, there are scientist superhero characters that are very active. But yeah, that is an example I can think of that is a pretty unique one. It kind of connects, I suppose, to some of the inventions, in fact, of that character I mentioned just now, the Count de Champignac. He invents an element called metamol. Actually, it's a liquid which can soften metal, a bit like flubber, I and as a result, he's able to, the Spiro is able to defeat an entire army with all their tanks and things by spraying it with this metal melting substance. So that's an example of a Champignac is particularly, the Comte de Champignac is a very, very interesting character in French comics. Pardon? Exactly, well, as they so often are, of course. As they so often are. And often you don't discover the thing that you want to discover. It's often an accident, happy accident, that throws up something unexpected and actually useful. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much. I hope it's been of interest to you. I was not quite. I hope some of you may decide that you want to explore comics a little bit. There are certainly something for almost everybody in this room, I suspect, you can find that will engage you, whether it's scientific or not. It's a very, very lively form right now. And I hope also maybe we can develop a bit more of some projects with the Royal Society of Chemistry and to bring science and comic artists together. To mention just briefly one very good example of that, there's two actually. There's one called Asteroid Belters, which was a really great free comic done, I can just try and remember, I think it was in Nottingham, I think, because there's a big science festival in Nottingham. Free newspaper which linked up scientists with cartoonists and put them across in children's comics form in a newspaper, free, explaining scientific principles. That was done here in this country. And the other book, I can't remember the title of it, was a free graphic novel with funding from the Royal Society or Royal something of Engineering.
Royal Academy of Engineering.
That's it, they are, Royal Academy of Engineering. And they worked with comic artists to do with sustainable futures and imagining how the future could be, and working with school kids who develop their own stories within the book, but also with professional comic artists to make visual stuff. And that's available almost certainly through their website. So these kind of innovative, participative educational comics, I think, are definitely a route that could be taken and which perhaps the society should get involved with as well.
From a purely chemistry perspective, there is The Comedian.
Oh yes, what is that?
Produced regularly
it's on your notes here.
It is on my notes here. It's produced by the Science Communication Group at the University of West England, and it's a chemistry-themed, superhero-based comic that they do. It's an educational resource that they produce, but again, definitely chemistry and definitely comics. But that is all we have time for. Thank you. Oh, we could go on all night, I'm sure. I'd just like to say again, thank you.
The geeks will inherit the earth, by the way. I'm sorry, it's happened already.
So can we have another round of applause for Paul? Thank you,
Ben.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good.